I still remember the sound the creek made that morning, soft and constant, like a whisper running through the stones. It was one of those perfect hiking days. Thin, high clouds, the scent of pine and wet earth, and that cool mountain air that wakes you up better than coffee ever could. I'd been following a faint trail through the foothills of the Bitterroots, trying to make my way toward a ridge that promised views of the valley below. Everything had been going according to plan until I stopped at a junction, one fork sloping toward a narrow ravine, the other climbing steeply through a stand of old firs. That's when I reached for my map and compass. Both were gone. I stood there a moment, staring down at my open pack as if they'd somehow crawl back in. The map must have slipped out when I stopped by the creek to refill my bottle. I remembered setting it on a rock beside my pack. The compass probably followed the same fate, rolled into the current while I was busy tying my bootlace. My GPS had already died that morning, its battery drained from the cold night. Just like that, the careful lines and bearings I'd plotted the night before meant nothing. But I wasn't lost. Not yet. I could still see the slope of the land, remember where the sun had been rising, recall that the stream generally flowed east. I told myself that as long as I paid attention, really paid attention, I could find my way. I took a breath and looked up. The sun sat high but slightly to the south just past midday. The air smelled of resin and moss, and the forest around me hummed with life. Flies droning, a squirrel scolding somewhere up the ridge. I picked the uphill trail, reasoning that it should lead me closer to the ridge I'd been aiming for. My boots crunched softly on dry needles, and every few steps I paused to glance back, memorizing landmarks. A snag with lightning scars, a boulder shaped like a crouching bear, the faint trace of the creek's glint through the trees. The trail thinned to almost nothing after half a mile, dissolving into a patch of ferns and broken rock. I could still feel the land slope beneath my feet though, upward, steady. That was good. But a sliver of unease slid in anyway, quiet and persistent, like a splinter you can't quite see. The forest here felt different, older, darker. Even the sound of the wind changed, whispering lower as if the trees were talking about me. I pressed on, repeating to myself the things I knew. North by the moss, west by the sun, downhill to water, facts, certainties. But still, a part of me couldn't shake the thought that maybe, just maybe, I'd chosen the wrong way. I kept climbing until the trees began to thin and patches of light spilled across the ground in shifting gold. The air grew sharper, scented with crushed sage and granite dust. For a moment, my confidence returned. This had to be the right way. The ridge couldn't be far. From there I'd see the valley, maybe even the faint ribbon of the forest road where my truck was parked. The thought steadied me. But the slope levelled off sooner than I expected, flattening into a broad saddle between two nameless humps of rock. The ground here was drier, scattered with juniper and twisted pine. The creek's murmur was gone, replaced by a silence so wide it almost rang in my ears. I turned slowly, trying to pick out some recognisable feature, but the landscape was all the same. Endless folds of grey-green hills, no peaks tall enough to serve as beacons. I found a stump and sat down, pulling out my water bottle. The sun felt hotter now, and I could see the faint shimmer of heat rising off the rocks. I tried to recall the map in my mind, the contour lines, the junction, the little blue thread of the creek. If the trail had turned west, I reasoned, then I should have been climbing along its right flank. But now I couldn't tell which direction I'd taken from that fork. The thought flickered through me like a chill. What if I'd been angling south this whole time? I stood and scanned the trees. Moss clung thick on their north sides, usually reliable, but here the pattern was patchy, disrupted by the dryness. Some trunks wore green coats all around, others none at all. Even the sun, hidden now behind a thin veil of cloud, had lost its edge. The light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, soft and confusing. "All right," I said aloud, just to hear a voice. "You've been here before. Trust what you know." So I began to move again, keeping the faintest breeze on my right cheek, the westerly I'd felt all morning. It wasn't much, but it gave me something to hold on to. Yet my boots crunched over brittle grass, the sound startling in the stillness. Every so often I caught myself glancing back, expecting to see the path I'd come from, but it had vanished into the scrub as if it had never existed. The landscape played tricks. A stand of pines I thought was 100 yards away turned out to be twice that. What looked like a narrow draw deepened suddenly into a gully I had to scramble across. My sense of direction, usually sharp as a knife, began to dull with each step. The confidence I'd built on years of hiking started to erode, grain by grain, until doubt was all that remained. When the first crow called, its voice echoing hollow against the hills, I realised I hadn't seen a single trail marker or footprint in hours. The silence that followed felt heavier than before. I stopped walking and listened. Really listened. The wind moved through the grass, the faint creak of branches high above, the sound of my heartbeat in my ears. That's when I finally admitted it to myself, quietly, like a confession whispered into the trees. I might not know where I am anymore. I don't know how long I stood there, staring at the horizon, waiting for the world to make sense again. The clouds drifted and broke apart, and sunlight came through in thin, slanted beams, lighting up the hills in patches. I took a breath and forced myself to think methodically. The basics. The sun was leaning west, which meant it was afternoon. My truck sat northeast of where I'd started. So, if I could keep the afternoon sun roughly on my left shoulder, I'd be moving in the right direction. Simple enough on paper, but the land didn't make things simple. The hills began to fold in on each other, steep-sided and confusing, like waves frozen in stone. I followed a dry wash for a while, thinking it might lead back toward the main drainage I'd crossed that morning. It did, for a time, until the wash split into 3 separate gullies, each one clawing off in a slightly different direction. I crouched and studied the dirt. There were no boot prints, no animal tracks, just wind-scoured dust. I picked the middle branch, mostly because it seemed to slope downward, and I figured water, if it existed, would choose the same way. It led me into a hollow lined with cottonwoods. Their leaves shimmered pale in the light, and I could smell the faint, wet sweetness that told me there might be moisture nearby. I dropped to my knees and pressed a palm to the ground. Damp! That was good. I followed the feeling downhill until I came upon a trickle of water threading through the rocks. Just a whisper of a creek, half buried in sand. Relief welled up in me. I wasn't found yet, but I wasn't lost beyond hope either. I filled my bottle and crouched beside the stream. The water was cold enough to sting my fingers. I drank deeply, then stared into the current. It moved east, judging by the angle of the sun, east toward the river valley. If I followed it, maybe I'd intersect a trail or even that forest road. My plan began to take shape again, but the longer I sat, the more the doubts crept in. The valley wasn't due east, it was northeast. What if this creek curved away and left me deeper in the backcountry? What if I was following the wrong water altogether? I turned and looked behind me. Every bend, every rise of the hills looked the same. The sameness was the worst part. It stripped you of any sense of movement. The light shifted again, and I noticed the shadows stretching longer. Late afternoon. I felt a prickle of urgency in my chest. I told myself to stop thinking and just move. So I followed the creek, keeping it in sight, stepping over rocks slick with moss and tangled roots. The forest grew denser as I went, the air cooler, the smell of wet soil thicker. At times, I'd look up and swear I recognised a ridge or tree shape, but when I tried to focus on it, it changed, as if the land were deliberately rearranging itself the moment I looked away. That's when the unease turned to something closer to fear. Not panic, not yet, but the first taste of it. I felt the forest watching me, not maliciously, but with the indifference of something vast and old. I tightened the straps of my pack and kept moving, whispering under my breath, "Just keep east, just keep east." The sound of water faded, swallowed by distance or by the wind. I turned a corner, expecting to see the creek again, but the bed was dry. I knelt, touched the sand, and found it bone dry. Somewhere, without realising it, I'd wandered off its course. The air felt suddenly colder, the forest impossibly quiet. And for the first time all day, I didn't know which way to turn. I stood in that dry creek bed, turning slow circles, trying to find where I'd gone wrong. The world around me had gone utterly still. No birdsong, no wind through the trees, not even the buzz of an insect. It was the kind of quiet that presses in, heavy and expectant. My mouth felt dry, though I'd just drunk from the stream minutes ago. I could feel the pulse of my heartbeat in my temples, loud and rhythmic, like a second clock ticking down in my head. The sun had sunk low enough that the forest was filling with long, crooked shadows. I took a few cautious steps in what I thought was the direction I'd come from, scanning the ground for the faint shimmer of water or a familiar tree. But the landscape had rearranged itself, or maybe it had always been like this and I'd only just noticed. The trees leaned differently. The slope of the hill didn't match what I remembered. Every angle was off by just enough to make me doubt my own eyes. That's when the panic began to nibble at the edges. Not the wild kind that makes you sprint into nowhere, but the slow creeping kind that whispers that maybe your instincts aren't worth much after all. I stopped, closed my eyes, and tried to slow my breathing. Sunset is west, I murmured. Truck is northeast. Keep the light to your left. The logic helped just a little. I reopened my eyes and spotted a clearing higher up the slope. If I could reach it before the sun dropped, maybe I'd regain some orientation. The climb was rough, loose shale and roots that snagged at my boots. Sweat slicked my palms, even as the air cooled. When I finally broke into the clearing, I could see more sky than I had all day. The sun was a red coin sinking behind the hills, painting the forest in rust and shadow. For a brief, heartening moment, I thought I recognised a ridge line to the north, but when I blinked, it blurred into the haze, indistinguishable from the rest. Still, I refused to stay put. The worst thing was to stop moving, to let the doubt settle. So I kept walking, angling toward where I believed northeast should be, guided by instinct and whatever sliver of reason I had left. The ground dipped and rose unpredictably, the forest thickening again around me. A branch cracked sharply underfoot. It startled me enough that I froze, listening for any echo. For a heartbeat, I thought I heard another step, light and deliberate, somewhere off to my right. I turned, peering into the dim tangle of trees. Nothing moved, nothing breathed. I told myself it was just an animal, deer, maybe, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was alive with attention, quietly studying me. By the time full dusk settled, I could barely see beyond 10 feet. I knew I had to stop soon. I found a small hollow between two boulders and cleared a space for my pack. The last light painted the rocks amber, then slipped away entirely. I sat there, in the cooling dark, hugging my knees, listening as the forest came back to life. Crickets starting up, an owl calling somewhere far off, the rustle of small feet through dry leaves. The fear eased a little then. The woods hadn't changed, I had. I'd just forgotten how to listen without needing to control. But as the first stars appeared and I tried to pick out the North Star through the branches, I realised I wasn't sure which patch of sky was north anymore. And that small shivering doubt that I couldn't even trust the stars settled deeper than any fear had yet. I don't remember falling asleep, only waking sometime in the small hours to a cold so sharp it felt alive. The air smelled of stone and pine pitch, and a thin mist crept through the trees like breath. My body ached from the uneven ground, but my mind was clear again, stripped clean by exhaustion. The stars above were bright enough to sting the eyes, more than I'd seen in years, and for a long time I just stared at them. Somewhere up there was Polaris, the one true point that doesn't move. It took me a while, tracing faint constellations through the canopy, but when I found it, steady and small between two fir branches, relief surged through me. I wasn't lost to the world entirely. North existed. I just had to reach it. When dawn came, it came soft and grey, the air damp and silent. I stretched the stiffness from my limbs and packed up what little I'd unpacked. My breath hung in the chill air as I began moving, this time carefully, slow, deliberate, counting each direction against the sun's new rise. The forest around me looked less menacing in daylight, though the sameness still played its tricks. I followed my compass of instinct, the moss's faint green bias on trunks, the leaning of tree crowns toward light, the distant sound, real or imagined, of running water. Hours passed that way, one cautious decision after another. I learned to read the land in smaller ways, the way wind carved through the grass, how lichen clustered on shaded stone, where deer trails dipped toward valleys. It wasn't certainty that guided me anymore, but patience. Every sign, no matter how small, felt like a conversation with the forest, and I started to trust that quiet dialogue more than I'd ever trusted my gear. By midday, I caught the scent of smoke, faint but human. My heart kicked up. I followed it downhill, moving faster now, ignoring the branches that whipped my arms. The smoke grew stronger until finally, through a screen of willows, I saw the glint of metal, the corner of a weathered trail marker. And just beyond it, the narrow cut of the old service road. I laughed then, half disbelief, half release. It wasn't triumph exactly, just the deep exhale of relief after holding your breath too long. I dropped my pack, leaned against a tree, and let the sun warm my face. Later, when I reached the truck, I sat a long while before starting it. I thought about the map floating somewhere miles downstream, about the compass lying in a bed of gravel, about how easily all the tools we rely on can vanish. What's left in the end is whether you can stay calm when the world stops offering answers. Out there, stripped of certainty, I'd learned something I hadn't expected, that sometimes the forest doesn't deceive you at all. It simply asks that you pay attention, that you quiet your mind long enough to listen. And if you do, it will guide you home, not through bearings or batteries, but through trust.